I would like to welcome you all to our third in a five-part series entitled Women in Tibetan Studies. Through this series, the Modern Tibetan Studies program at Columbia University aims to recognize 5 distinguished women who have contributed to enriching the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies through their scholarship, professional activity, and leadership. And we would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute for its financial and logistical support, and the Department of Religion for additional financial aid. Many students have already left for spring break, but we warmly welcome those of you who are here today and all those participating online. We invite you to please join the discussion after Professor Willis's talk by typing any questions you may have in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will relay those as able. Now, I want to introduce our speaker today, Jan Willis. Professor Jan Willis will be teaching. We'll be talking about teaching Tibetan Buddhism in the Western Academy, and we just want to give you a brief introduction to some of her studies. She studied with Tibetan Buddhists in India, Nepal, Switzerland, and the U.S. for 5 decades, and has taught courses in Buddhism for over 40 years. She's the author of The Diamond Light, an Introduction to Tibetan Buddhist Meditation in 1972, so one of the earliest. And also on Knowing Reality, the Tattvartha chapter of Asanga's Bodhisattvabhumi, which was published in 1979, based on her 1976 Columbia University dissertation. She worked with Alex Wayman here. And in this context, I think I can introduce her as the first Black person to get a PhD in Tibetan studies, the first woman to get a PhD, at least in the US that we know of, to get a degree in Tibetan studies. And as a fellow Southerner, the first Southerner to get a PhD in Tibetan Buddhist studies. She also went on to work on Enlightened Beings, life stories from the Ganden Oral Tradition, and my favorite book, Dreaming Me, Black Buddhist and Baptist One Woman's Spiritual Journey, in 2008. And if you haven't read it, it brings to life the interactions of the Tibetans as they came into exile. They're a really unique lens, and so I highly recommend it. And also, she's the editor of Feminine Ground Essays on Women and Tibet. She's been listed in Time as one of the 6 spiritual innovators of the new millennium. She was the recipient at Wesleyan University's Binswanger Prize for Excellence in Teaching in 2003. And in 2007, Ebony magazine recognized her as one of its Power 150 most influential African Americans. So without any further ado, I turn the event over to you, and thank you very much for being here.
So I want to begin by thanking you for being here and those who are online for joining us. I want to say it's amazing. Amaho. 50 years ago, I lived here, just across the street from the entrance of this building. And I went to Kent Hall every day and got my degree here eventually, Tattvartha chapter, Bodhisattvabhumi. And so it's quite wondrous and it's quite joyful, to be back here again, especially under these circumstances, to meet with you, students and colleagues, all interested in Tibetan studies. That's great, feels good. So thank you. Thank you, Lauren, for the invitation. Thank you, Ray, for this special invitation. I'm so pleased to be here. Okay. So my talk today is comprised of 3 parts. It's about teaching Buddhism in the Western Academy, the challenges of teaching Tibetan Buddhism, and the challenge of being a scholar practitioner. Kedu. So I do that a lot, sorry. But I don't think there's time to talk about doing Buddhism, that particular introductory course. But you should know that my whole career almost 50 years of teaching, has been an undergraduate institution. I spent 1 year at UVA, and that was interesting. But my heart's always been with undergraduate. And so Chris Wiedenmeyer and Brandon Dotson and Ganden and Thurman and others have come through as I've taught at Wesleyan for the most part. I spent 36 years there. So I've been teaching courses in Buddhism for almost 50 years, well over 45 years, let's say. And I've taught the Intro to Buddhism, specialized seminars that are spin-offs from that course. So I've taught Women in Buddhist Lit, Women in Buddhism, Buddhism in America, Tibetan Buddhism, and so forth. Students, in order to enter those specialized seminars, have to have completed Intro to Buddhism. So, and I've done the Intro to Buddhism at Wesleyan for many, many years. Whenever I'm there, I do it. And there had always been a wait list. I should say, I recognize that I'm older. So my experience on teaching Buddhism comes from, a decade or two ago for many of you, right? And the things I'll be saying about those times go back somewhat. Okay, so in the olden days at Wesleyan, I would cap my courses in Intro Buddhism to 90. And there would always be typically 100 to 150 students on the wait list for that course. And I taught it every spring. So there was great interest in Buddhism at the undergraduate level. Why was that? Well, Wesleyan's sort of an elite Northeast school, right? The parents wanted their students to go to an undergraduate institution where they'd be taught by actual faculty members and not grad students. So they chose Wesleyan. And they wanted the students, upon graduation, their children, to be world citizens. They wanted them to be interested in things and have creative problem-solving skills and to have some empathy for others in the world. So I was always delighted at the kinds of students I got to share a classroom. Really top-notch. Even though, for the most part, when they first arrived, they wanted to know about two things. They wanted wisdom, tell me, give it to me. And they wanted meditation, I want the end of that, give it to me. And I'm thinking, well, this is a university, So wisdom is gained, Buddhist texts tell us by, how is it gained? It's gained by study, by hearing Chintamaya praying, by reflecting upon what you hear, and then by meditating on it, make it real. Well, I thought, at least in the days I was beginning to teach, late 70s, well, we couldn't really bring meditation to the classroom. Don Swear did it at Swarthmore, and it was like, oh. I thought it was sort of cool, but maybe not yet at Wesleyan. At any rate, but that's what students wanted. And what Thomas Tweed calls, the nightstand Buddhist, the students who came to Wesleyan into an intro class already had some familiarity. They had seen the Dalai Lama's picture on the Jumbotron. Times Square was there for 6 months at a time, and the caption said, think different. And I always wanted, it was an ad for what, IBM?
Apple.
Apple. And I always wanted it to say differently, but I had nothing to do with it. There was this Dalai Lama, huge picture, 3 stories high, and the caption, think different. So they'd seen that. They'd seen movies, Kundun, 7 years in Tibet, and they've traveled. So they've been to India, they've been to Nepal, or their parents had. So they came, they wanted wisdom, meditation, give it to us. And even the Buddha couldn't do that. So, I can't give it to you, Tao. I can't give you the view that liberates you, right? Just give it to you. Oh, you got another class? Sure. Pick it up on your way out. Power. So there were those challenges, but mostly we just enjoyed reading about and reflecting about these ideas. And I think one of the things I did in undergraduate courses was provide a space for people to do. I think if you looked at, I'm speaking generally now, but Buddhism course, I think if you looked at my courses early on, I privileged text over living things, living people. And then more and more, I incorporated more practices like mandala making, because things come alive for students when they're hands-on. So, but that took some time to develop. So one last thing I'll say about intro courses, intro to Buddhism, before I get into the challenges of Tibetan Buddhism. I'll say this. I always try to give students a chance, and this is because I am particularly interested in myself, narrative and storytelling. I always try to give students a chance to be very creative with what they're learning. So I just want to read for you. This is the typically about 8 weeks into a 13 or 14-week semester. I give students an assignment, a written assignment, that goes like this. Now this is the intro course. We've done sort of the ideas, a little bit of Buddha's life, a little bit about where those ideas might have come from, connected with the life. What's Buddhism in a nutshell? You know, like I like Dhammapada 183, do no harm, practice virtue, discipline the mind. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas. In a nutshell, right? I try to introduce those and let students discover it, right? That's the best kind of learning. They discover it themselves. They didn't hear it from you. So sometimes this has happened, but this is the typical exercise, written exercise I ask students to complete. So they learned a little about Buddhism. And then we read a little Kulavagga 10 about the founding of the nuns, right? And then, so I give this assignment. Imagine yourself as a 6th century BCE Indian woman, whether young or old, daughter, wife, or widow. One day, a Buddhist nun appears in your village or town, teaching the Buddha's doctrine, and inviting you to join the order. What would be your response? Why? So this is the continuation of the assignment. This question is designed to invite your creativity, as well as to help you bring together much of the material we've learned here. It is designed, therefore, to have you do three things. One, to portray and comment upon a given woman's social situation. 2, to deftly summarize the Buddha's main teaching, right? A nun comes teaching, you've got a paragraph to do that. 3, to react to the teaching's attractiveness or non-attractiveness, given the circumstances you have initially asked. Make sure that your essay addresses all 3 of these points. 2 to 3 pages tops. If it's longer, I'll give it back. I have had the most incredible narratives written by men and women in this course. Students can't wait, to get home and get typing. So that's been very pleasurable. Okay. Tell you a success story before I get into the challenges of teaching Tibetan Buddhism. Okay. So, challenges of teaching Tibetan Buddhism, one of those spin-off seminars. Well, first, there's the issue of the language. You know, what is silent affix, silent prefix? How are we supposed to pronounce that? You know, finding source material. I mean, here's great, right? Sources of Tibetan tradition. Why? Why now?
A little too late.
Little too late for me. Oh, I looked for that. Oh,
Tattvartha was probably here when you were here. You could have worked with him.
you're right, but I didn't.
I don't think he was ready.
Yeah.
I don't think he was ready for it.
Yeah. We had wonderful text coming out of Columbia, you know, that series. And wonderful. Sources of Tibetan tradition would have been piece of cake. So luckily I had in 2005, John Powers did intro, and then he did a shortened version of intro, right? And you could actually introduce it to a class, especially the concise one. And then you'd have to balance getting readings, right? Getting sources that were not overly watered down and not overly laden with Tibetan terminology. That was difficult. And so in my Tibetan Buddhism course, you know, I'd have them read Tibetan Book of the Dead, Fremantle, and Trungpa. And then we'd watch a film, you know, and there are a number of documentaries on. But, you know, we'd watch one there in Ladakh. Here's the Tibetan Book of the Dead being acted out. You could see it. At least in those days, there may be more modern takes. So I introduced film and documentary when I could. I would try to make the language a little less daunting, though that was always an issue. And when I thought about it, you know, here's a story. The way I learned Tibetan grammars didn't prepare us for it. Oh, I was invited, and I did, though my parents wondered why I was going back to that place so far overseas. My father once told a neighbor that their daughter was back from Naples. Nepal, that was just too far for the steelworker dad. You know, that was too far to conceive of. So that, but I was in Nepal and in Bodhanath and staying at the Samdeling, the Gelugpa monastery in Bodhanath. Oh, and I was the only Westerner, I was the only woman, 60 monks, 18 Lamalas, 10 Mongolian monks, 50 Tibetan, all refugees in Samdeling. But I'd been asked, and so I get there after senior year, and I say to Sonam, the manager there, "Hello, my name is I'm looking for Losang Chujur. Losang Chujur. Oh, Losang Chujur, India." So my heart sinks. You know, I've been writing all year, you know, here I am. He's not here. Losang Chujur, India. And then I said, "Oh, well, my name is Jan Willis." Jan Willis. Jan Willis, Losang Chujur room. Losang Chujur room. Put me in it. It had been arranged beforehand. Losang Chujur wasn't there, but I got his room. So now this was like, whew, just from one day to the next, living in Losang Chujur's room on that little bed where, you know, you had to, right? You couldn't stretch out. There was a skull cup. Didn't know what people did with that. Didn't know. I'm new. I knew a little Hindi. I didn't know Tibetan. So my job was to learn Tibetan with the Lamalas, you know, the little ones. Every morning, stand up against the wall, almost like we're davening, you know, we're reciting. And I'm the tallest in the line, right? There's one hydrant out back. The day started at 4:30. It's still dark. I try to make it before. There's 60 men got used that one hydrant, right? So usually I could make it, but sometimes. All right, and then I took my place in the line, and then we would. You may have heard of Miksema, which is it's Geluk. It's a chant to Tsongkhapa. And one day I just could not make it to the line. So I'm still collapsed, as much as one can be collapsed on a 4.5-foot bed. I just can't get up and join. But for the first time, I saw the importance of chanting as a means of connecting the monosyllables. Tibetan's monosyllabic, right? Every syllable has meaning, right? You need to know how they're connected in order to translate. So I'm lying there and I hear da 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 da. Me measure Chi making be one jump a young. Do boom are you jumps it somewhere da. Dungeon gave a suki song kapa. Low song la solwa de. So that chant, 2 syllables, 2 syllables, 2 syllables, 3 syllables, names the deity or the person, right? Grammar books don't tell you that. They don't say, if you're looking at verse, count the syllables and see how you're going to arrange them. None of that. So I said, learning Tibetan for me was an inside thing. All right? You know, the insider, outsider, that conundrum. If I had not intuited that chanting was about connecting those syllables, I wouldn't have learned Tibetan. Anyway, so I got it in a flash, like a flash of insight. And then learning Tibetan was sort of smooth. So I mentioned it here. This is the confession. So when I'm in a classroom teaching Tibetan Buddhism, what do I do with that mythic, implied correspondence world of meaning? Because at some point, it's clear, this is for all teachers the case, the teachers know a little bit more than the students. Usually that's how you want it, right? Right, but when you're talking about esoteric tantric practice, you know a little bit more about it than they might see just looking at the outside. So I mentioned that I have my students sometimes construct mandala. And from that practice and surrounding that practice, we use Geshe Tarson's book on constructing mandalas, a little book written by a Tibetan on what's going on when you create a mandala. You know, when you don't, I take my rings to class one day, everybody's anxious, you know, right? We're gonna build mandalas today. But they get to know that it's not just a pretty painting. It's not just a sand painting that they might see. Oh, Hopis do that in the Southwest. You know, it's a sand painting, I got it. But it's more than 2-dimensional, isn't it? It goes up and it goes down, right? So we learn these things. And I have these great photos of variegated colors of hands in the circle, everybody making mandala. And they've learned something. But my confessional part was, here's a place where what's inner and outer might touch upon the secret. How dare I know enough and presume enough to share that with students, or dare I say, uninitiated? It provides some trepidation, maybe? I don't know. Maybe that's too strong. Let me tell you another example. I and members of my department were once interviewing people for a job slot. And one of the young women, very knowledgeable, had read up on members of the department. So right in the middle of, she asked, we're interviewing her, and she says to me, Jan, you teach Tibetan Buddhism, but I understand you might also practice. Is that problematic? And I said, well, it's like, not for me, but yeah, well, yeah. I said, but if I'm talking about Tantra, it's an esoteric tradition. So if I didn't know something about its inner workings, how in the world would I know what was going on at all? Many a person has looked at a Chud ritual and written an article, a scholarly article, on how violent, how corrupt. This is proof of the pessimism of Buddhism, the Chud practice. It's violent. I thought it was about selflessness. It's violent. What do those people have in their minds? You can see it written. So you have to know something about the inner workings. Right? The correspondence is there's the implied meaning. That's necessary. Okay. Not too confessional. So I talked about the Mixema, and so here's the last thing I want to share with you before Q&A. I think it was the end of the 90s, it might have been early 2000s. Chuck Prebish wrote a memoir. I don't remember the name. So he wrote a memoir. He taught it. He's just retired. He taught at Penn State. And Tibetan studies, but his sort of main focus was Buddhism in America, sociology of religion. But he wrote a memoir in which he said, one day, I don't know, I was feeling full and happy, and I talked to my chair and I said, I practice Buddhism. He said to his chair. And he said, thereafter, colleagues stopped talking with me. The chair said, there may never be tenure in your future. There may never be promotion to full in the future. He says all of this, so I can say it. So in that time period, a couple of decades ago, for anybody who taught religious studies, especially religious studies, if you had any affinity for what you taught, that was definitely a no. You had to have the objective distance. I don't know what they call it. Then there was a necessary objective distance required, especially if you taught religion. But some of my colleagues took this to mean disdain for what you taught. And it's really sad, I found, that as I've gotten older, that it's not so unusual for people who teach in religious studies departments to be hostile towards the religious tradition they teach. It's an inner thing, but that's a personal psychological thing. You can have personal opinions. I think it is destructive to teach that hostility to your students, to impart that to your students. I don't think that is what teachers do. And unfortunately, some do. It's how you show, hey, I earned this PhD. Oh, come on. Maybe that's not the case today. I certainly hope it's. But this scholar-practitioner thing has real, it's challenging. Last story. Recently, now this could be 10 years for me, at a conference at Garrison. And I was having a very fine time. I spent a couple of days trying to figure out why. I was enjoying all the conversation. The third day, just like when the Tibetan became clear, I realized that there were only 2 other professors in a group of 200. In other words, this was a conference of Buddhist practitioners. So I not only felt at ease with them, I felt grateful that they had included me. Now that's a big confession. I felt grateful they had included me. And I really enjoyed the conference. Okay. Don't know if I've said everything I wanted, but maybe with Q&A, unless you want to, maybe this would be a good time to show some pictures. Is that all right? I brought these photos to share with Gray and Lauren. And Lauren immediately said, hey, do you mind? Gray said, can I take a picture of these pictures? Lauren said, can I take a picture of these and show them? So that wasn't my intention. This was just a few photos I grabbed on the way as I was packing to come here.
And I'll pull up the Q&A while I get.
Yeah. Could we show those photos? So when I told you about learning the Tibetan language, right? So during that same year, I asked the man, going backwards now, I asked the manager, who are the teachers in the area? Now, here's another thing I haven't mentioned that might be important. A fair number of people who are in Tibetan studies, are seeking PhD. They're going to translate a text. They're going to edit a text, right? Here's the other conundrum about scholar-practitioner. Tibetan Buddhism requires, in a certain sense, that we have living teachers, not just texts, right? But we have living teachers whom we respect. That's getting close to being anathema in the Western Academy. That's not how it's done. So as Don Lopez and some others say, it's their curators of the Buddha say, when we went to get our PhDs, we had to make of those lamas our informants as we translated our texts. But in order to really know what those teachers were teaching, as I suggested before, we had to know the inner thing, like we had to practice a little ourselves, okay? The other thing that sets me apart from Don Lopez and some others, when I went to Nepal, I was looking for not just my PhD, but an answer to the suffering I was dragging around with me, having been raised during the Jim Crow era of the South, seeing the water sign, the signs over the water fountains, white, colored, having visits from the clan when I got scholarships to college. Okay? So I wanted to know, when I met these Tibetans in Sarnath, I was in Benares first, they seem to have a joy about them. They seem to have an amazing joy about it. And I knew that they just suffered themselves this incredible historical trauma. They had been kicked out of their country. So I figured these folk can help me. So I had another reason for wanting to have a teacher could help me out of suffer. Oh, let's go back to Lama. So back one. Oh, so when I asked Sonam in the monastery where I was studying Tibetan, he said, up on that place, he took me outside and pointed, I think it looked for monastery in Bodna, pointed up the hill. In those days, it was all green, rice paddies. Now it's just buildings, but pointing up, he said, that's Kopan. At Kopan, there's this Lama called Lama Tutanyeshi. And he and Lama Zopa there. When I heard the name Lama Tutanyeshi, my hair stood on. That sort of, that bit that you read in some numtar, or you read in some stories. It happened twice, both times, when I heard the name of Lama Yeshe before I met him. Other stories if you want to ask about that. But so the other part of that was Tibetans seemed to find something special in me. And this is why I showed this picture. I love Lama Zopa. But when I would do prostrations, Tibetans like, la, la, la. And I'm going, what happened? So one day, and so I tried to I wanted to disappear, please don't draw attention to me. I'm tender. And the one teacher, said to a group of monks surrounding him, as I was taking a lady to meet him, Tushik Rinpoche down in Bodna, Tushik Rinpoche told a story of the blonde spot in my head. Can you barely make it out? I'm prostrating. And I'm about to introduce this woman who wants to interview. Tushik Rinpoche says to the other monks, best I could make out, and then I asked, oh, she built one of the early monasteries. She built Samye. That's what he said, like a couple of people had said that to me before. I thought, oh yeah, right. I didn't understand it. The blonde spot, Tushik Rinpoche explained, was the sampa flower that came sprinkled in the workers who had built Samye, some at day by day and some at night. I'm a day worker. Sprinkled sampa in their hair. And so Tushik Rinpoche explained that people who had these spots, I no longer have them, they make 10, have these spots in their hair. And that's a karmic connection. They built Samye. So this is a picture to illustrate there used to be a blonde spot. And Lama Zopa was wonderful. And when I met the Lamas, they were young. So it wasn't this old, revered person. This is Lama Zopa, and he's maybe 3 years older than me, really skinny, only wanted to be a yogi. And Lama Yeshe, who is my teacher, would come by and say, oh, Zopa, you're going to have to teach. You're going to have to teach. Lama Zopa only wanted to retreat and meditate. But then Lama Yeshe had begun the courses at Kopan. Been going on now since 1970. Take our next slide, please. I'll try to be. So this is a revisiting with the group that I studied with. When I said I was studying with the Lama Laws, this is a revisit. So they've gotten a little older, but I used to stand in line with them to learn Tibetan. And this is Sonam. Children, Sonam, share up one of the little Rinpoches. Yeah, next slide, please. But this was an assortment. I didn't bring a PowerPoint. This is Lama Yeshe. He's my teacher. This was on his first visit to the US. And we are visiting Yeshe Zopa, who was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, enrolled Lama on, Deshan Rinpoche maybe. But Lama Zopa started in 1968 at University of Wisconsin, Madison. And Lama Yeshe, Yeshe Soka was one of Lama Yeshe's teachers. So when Lama Yeshe came to the States, we visited Yeshe Soka in Madison. And I was very happy when he was with me, when I was with him. And this is when we're older. There's no order to these. This is, we did sort of chronology as best we could. In 1981, because I had translated the life stories, the Ganden Oral Tradition, Nengyu, which Thupten Jinpa is coming out recently with a book including 15 texts. And he talks about, my book is called Enlightened Beings, the first 6 in the tradition that Tsongkhapa taught the Gelug Mahamudra to. And Thupten Jinpa talks about those 6 and a few more. And he translates 15 texts in a book called, I don't think it's out yet. I think it'll be out in November. It's the Gelug Nengyu. Those were the tantric practice texts. And so in 1981, I was asked to teach the life stories at Vajrapani Institute in California. And Lama Zopa would talk about the practice. I talked about their life stories. Okay. Thank you. This is back at Kokan. I'm talking with Geshe Jampa Gyatso. Yeah, I don't know. This is Lama Yeshe back at Vajrapani, 1983, and his assistant, Owa. Owa died last year, age 96. He was a famous drummer in Santa Cruz. This is, so Lama Yeshe was giving me a hug. One of the things that my 15 years with Lama Yeshe did was build my confidence. Remember I said I was looking for something more? Boy, he did that just hundreds of times over. Just the technique is between him and me. He told me not only was I intelligent, but that my nature was pure. Oh, Buddha nature, you know, that kind of thing. He said to me one day, I say one thing. I mean, his English wasn't that great, but he'd say, daughter, always call me daughter. Daughter, I say one thing, you see 5. But because I was so insecure, I said, is that bad, Lama? Is that bad? I said, no, silly. It means you're quick. Your mind's quick. And so over the next few years, no matter the size of the crowd, if we were having a discussion, you would see Lama Yeshe do this. You walking along? I say one thing, you see 5. So, I mean, no PhD is that, you know, that kind of confidence. Oh, that kind of thing. Okay, next photo, please. This is a picture of myself and Professor Alex Wayman, who was my teacher here. But this is this is a conference where Greg Samuel, Ava Dargay, also maybe Martin was there. I don't remember where it was, but it was a couple years after I graduated from Columbia. And I was happy, unlike when I was here. No, I don't mean I don't mean it. I mean, come on. I had an apartment that was rent controlled, $108. $108.
Almost vicious.
$108. The person, I was walking out dejected. She said, no, we have nothing for you. I said, but I live in Fort Washington Heights. These people, they work during the day. They keep the doors open. I'm studying Sanskrit. I get attacked on the trains because I have the little, Sanskrit book for high schoolers. We used that at in those days. I got attacked once on the train. What is that? Because it had the brown paper on it to hold it together. The woman attacked me with an umbrella. Reading that smut. I learned Sanskrit. But after I graduated and I got a job, and I came back, see, then I was a professor. I think that's why I'm smiling. All right, there probably were two. Oh, so I sometimes now have taught courses on Buddhism and race. I talk about the Buddha, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Howard Thurman, and some women too, because nonviolence is central, I think. It's central to me. And remember that nutshell of Dhammapada 183, that's where it starts. Do no harm. That's what we should do. So part of that is this friendship between Martin Luther King and Tim King. This is the, what do you call this? Press conference, just before King gave the quit Vietnam speech, that Riverside speech, which was quite wonderful. They only met twice, but when Martin Luther King was assassinated, apparently Thich Nhat Hanh said, I pledge to carry on with creating a beloved community. So they shared them. And the people at Lions Roar made this up for a short essay I did for them, talking about Buddhism and activism. They made this, they created this graphic, and I liked it. And they said, be free to use it. So because I thought, surely the Buddha would have that sign during these times. So I call this my activist Buddha. Yeah. This is my course on Buddhism and race. It's race through a Buddhist lens. This is a class at Agnes Scott College where I taught for the last 8 years. It's just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in Decatur, Georgia. Great students. You might know this is Dhammanand, who founded nunnery outside of Bangkok. And she wants to, and her mother was Boramai, the only woman to have an amulet made of her. And when her mother got sick, then Anandamai, whom I met as a professor of women's studies and history at Thammasat University, when her mother became ill, she decided that she would go to Sri Lanka. She did 2 years of probation, and she came and after her mother passed away, she heads this nunnery in Bangkok. This is the group I work with, and they've all graduated. So this is Jack Cornfield, Gina Sharp, Kate Wheeler, I didn't say before, that's me. And all these were our students over 4 years to become officially credentialed at Spirit Rock as Spirit Rock teachers. They could add that to their resume. Oh, hodgepodge of photos. In 2019, in October of 2019, 60 Black teachers spent a week together. It was wonderful at Spirit Rock, 60 Black teachers, Dharma Center teachers. We spent a week together, and then on the weekend, so October 12th, Saturday, busted loads of Black Buddhist practitioners came to Spirit Rock, and Angela Davis and I had a public conversation about freedom and liberation. I enjoyed. That's Lama issue. think that's probably good enough. That's what makes it.
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions.
Uh-huh.
So if I can start.
Thank you for looking at the photos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's wonderful. And seeing the picture of Thich Nhat Hanh, I thought I'd start with a question from the Thich Nhat
Okay.
Hanh Center of Engaged Buddhist Studies at the Union Theological Seminary. We have a question from
Right.
Professor Rima Vesely-Vlad. I think you.
I know Rima.
She says, "Thank you, Jan. You were talking about your teachers." I typed this question in your memoir. You talk about the resonance that you had for your first teacher, a Tibetan monk in exile. You wrote that you felt he understood your suffering as a Black woman experiencing racism in the US. I'm curious about other ways that Tibetan Buddhism might resonate with Black people in the US. Images such as male-female interactions, as well as a seemingly non-binary embodiment, seems to be mentioned in your personal reflections. So.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Rima, for the great question. And if I may, let me just say, I think I've written this somewhere, but it seems to me that tantric practice offers a great way for people to change their, the identity that we walk around with every day. Lama Yeshe said in Introduction to Tantra, if we constantly perceive ourselves as sad, unworthy, we will become this. It's all the mind, right? And the practice of Tantra requires of us what? Through visualization, taking the end as a means. Huh? You want to have the capability of green Tara? Visualize yourself as green Tara. Oh, so I think in terms of method, as Lama Yeshe would say, method, TH, method, tantric visualization lends itself very well to the practice of visualizing ourselves differently. So we're weighted down with these limiting images of ourselves. Let's take some Vajrapani and Mahakala, right? It's not wrathful, it's what? Powerful. That would be good. I hope I've answered just a little bit. There's some Tibetan practice that seems to me works very well with helping people to transcend negative identities.
And then another question from maybe the part of the academy that you addressed, that feeling that Prevish had. Yeah. So Ben Norse, I know, is a student of Curtis Schaefer, and Curtis Schaefer studied also with, or he worked with the chair of the religion department in Alabama also.
I met Curtis in Florida.
Right.
Right. Okay.
And McCutcheon, whose book Critics Not Caretakers, right, has been influential. So Benjamin asks, you have encouraged us not to teach religion from a hostile standpoint, but I wonder what you think about trying to balance criticism of a tradition when that might be appropriate, the treatment of women in particular ways, for example, with an appreciation for the tradition. Is it appropriate to criticize the tradition, especially for someone teaching something like Tibetan Buddhism who is not Tibetan? How much should one seek to balance that with instilling appreciation? And do we have a role in helping students overcome both negative and positive stereotypes?
Absolutely. Yes. And I hope I may have, but I hope I didn't suggest that you leave or that any student should leave their intelligence at the door. I'm all about using what you have to think creatively through these things. Not at all, Ben, hoping that I convert these students, just hoping that I show them they can be kind. That's, I mean, yeah, that sounds like chicken out, but I certainly don't mean don't criticize. I actually know people who, because of their life story, I'm just in the life story, because of their life story, are hostile to what they teach. I think that's a sad situation. I've seen it so many times, and I've seen it in religion departments because that's where I've been. I can't say it, you might know the people. Sorry. But I certainly don't mean no. Yes, we should be critical. We should think. We should test. I think the part that I meant, and I might have left out of this conundrum about teaching in the Western Academy, that I just want to fill in here, is how to put it. Maybe I should say it's about the objective distance. You can't always have that. And you especially can't have it when you're talking about chakra. I guess. I don't know, Ben, if I answered you. See, I'm looking at the phone talking. I'm old school, sorry.
That camera, well, that been somewhere out there through that camera.
Yes.
Can we get the lights back up on? Well,
be critical, be intelligent.
Yeah.
I think I always could count on my students for that. That's why I didn't have to worry.
Exactly. An anonymous attendee wants to thank you and asked, today's March 10th. So how do you teach students about the plight of Tibetan Buddhists in China?
Well, I haven't done that. But when there's been a course on Tibetan Buddhism, I try to have them read not only Western accounts, but Tibetan accounts of what's going on in there. Because I think where I come from, coming from where I do, it's important always have insider indigenous voices, not just the distant white gaze, right? So all I can say is I would have them read Tibetans. And there are essays and accounts written by
Tibetans. And Jonathan Gold, who teaches at Princeton, is also thanks you for your talk and your work, and asks, we need more Black faculty teaching Buddhism in the academy. What do you think might be the most beneficial ways to help bring that about?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for your work. Well, I think Black people may feel that this is not a place for them because they can't see themselves there. So that group photo with you saw Jack on the picture, but the thing is we were teaching 30 Black LGBT folk over 4 years. So that Spirit Rock, which would credential them as teachers. So the idea is representation is important. Being there is important. So make available scholarships, ways that they can be there. Then they'll stop, it'll stop feeling like a strange place when you can see yourself. Unfortunately, that's still true. We need to be able to see ourselves. Then it feels more welcoming, You drive through a neighborhood and there's a sign in the yard that says Black Lives Matter. You say, oh, nice. Then they aren't going to run out of the house and say Blue Lives Matter too. There's some understanding there. There's some understanding there. There's some empathy there. There's some, okay. It's makes one feel better. So seeing, we have to make that a fact. And some people are trying to make that a fact. Thank you.
Yeah. So Tibetan Tsering Wangmo has lots of questions. So I'll kind of bring them out one at a time. So you don't have to try to remember them all. But in academia, from the time that you started to the current time, 3, 4, 5 decades later now, has the expectation to have objective distance, and she puts in quotes, changed? And in what ways has it changed, particularly in religious studies?
Well, I think it's certainly not considered just a counterculture hippie phenomenon. It's more accepted that, yes, I go to Tibet and I study these texts with Tibetans. It's more acceptable that you work closely with Tibetans in Tibetan studies. And that is okay. Whereas I think when I started, that was just a no-no. It was something you didn't say. You didn't add. If you added it, you might not get promoted, as Chuck didn't. Chuck had to go to Utah, right? Oh,
And
amazing.
then her next question is there any sort of active interaction between Tibetan Buddhist studies and race studies in the US?
This seems to me to be a question about which traditions get out there and get active first. And I think it's different for different traditions. I think when we think about engaged Buddhism, for example, in prison work, I mean, Zen folk got out there early. Mindfulness people got out there early. And Tibetan Buddhists, not so much. Now, of course, there's the prison liberation. Lama Yeshe's folk and followers have done good with the prison thing, very well. And with hospitals in India. And so one doesn't see it quite as much. Or the Kung Fu nuns in, you might see that. Would go on. But I think more and more, little by little, Tibetans are getting more engaged. Tibetan Buddhists are getting. Some teachers already were, and some teachers now more and more. Environmentalism, prison work, and there's more engagement. Thank you, saying more.
Yeah, you write about how you reconciled yourself to your Baptist faith after you had been in a Buddhist community, but she asks, what was the reaction of your Baptist community when you went to study Buddhism in Nepal?
Good one. My cackle, excuse me. I told you about my father in Naples. My father, who always encouraged me and who called me daughter till he died. And I hadn't heard it until Lama Yeshe called me daughter. And when I went home, that's all they thought they ever called me, daughter. And he was very supportive. My mother said time and time again, Dean, my middle name, I don't see God anywhere in this. I don't see God anywhere in any of these things you've written. My father would say, now, Dot, Dorothy was her name. When she says this, that's just like, this. And sometimes he would say Paul, and I go, oh, no, that's not like Paul. So my father was the go-between, the interpreter, right? And the one who encouraged me. And my mother said once, they pay her a lot of money just for 2 hours of work a week. To which my father responded, Dot, they don't pay her for what she does. They pay her for what she knows. That was his pride. My father, so sweet. Always wanted to push us, go further. So the world was big, even though he couldn't imagine it. He wanted us to experience a bigger world. And what Lama Yeshe always said was, check up, dear, check up. And I find this is what Buddhism says from the beginning too. But before the Buddha taught at Sarnath, he calls those former 5 who had meditated with him, he calls them forward, presumably because as ordinary folk, they couldn't understand these pithy teachings. And what does he say? Ehi, pasika, come, see for yourself. So Lama Yeshe's translation of that is check up, dear, check up. So if you're feeling something is off, don't put on blinders, check it out, check up. I think Tibetan Buddhism, with the way the Lama is revered, lends itself. But it doesn't mean that exclusively this is the only tradition as these traditions come to the West. Since the 80s, there have been a lot of scandals. And I think students have to check up. And they should. There are guidelines for teachers as well as guidelines for students.
Any questions in the room before I turn to the
Yeah.
question? Okay, so we have one more from online, and I think it's a good one because it opens the field up broadly, and then we'll let you go. But Joy Brennan asked,
Oh, Joy.
I would like to ask about your thoughts about the field of Buddhist philosophy in specific. What do you think the field needs? What are some directions that haven't been explored that you think should be good?
I think Joy is already working on much of this because she works on Yogacara. And I could use much of her material in my course on race through a Buddhist lens, because what is one of the things that Asanga and Yogacharan say? We've got this thing in front of us. It looks one way if you come in famished and thirsty. It looks another way if you just jumped out of a pool. It looks another way. This is how Yogacharans, right? So as a way of talking about bias, I can easily see how Yogacara and exploring whiteness and blackness, how that comes about. Because when these individual biases get marshaled, things get tribal like they are. That's so much delusion. So I think they're both their regions in Yogacara and in Madhyamaka where constructive and helpful, beneficial studies await. Nagarjuna said, Joy knows this, I'm sure. Nagarjuna said that between samsara and nirvana, there is not the slightest thread of difference. What's that mean? Not the slightest thread of difference. Really, I'm asking, I want to engage you. What does that mean? Is this world samsara? I don't think so. between samsara and nirvana, not the slightest thread of difference. It's like mind does one or mind does the other. You can say Lord Sampa's little waistline sort of got a little crick in it this way. The mind just turned just a little. You see things differently. You might say that might be you. You might. So, you know, it's not in the thing, right? It's in here, whether it's samsara or nirvana. If it's, if I see it with attachment, I know this is simplistic, but I'm saying it's a takeoff from that, right? How we see things, epistemology. So if I see it with attachment, it's still samsaric. See it free of attachment, there's nirvana. Not the slightest thread of difference in the thing. It's in my perception. Thank you, Joy, and thank you for your work.
And I just wanted to say from Gregory Hillis, appreciation and gratitude.
Oh
Professor
my goodness.
Janice Dean Willis, my first professor of Buddhism at UCSC 47
Oh,
years
Greg.
ago. You were and continue to be an enormous influence on my life and work even now. Big love, and with that, thank you.
Greg.
That is
Greg,
a nice,
decades.
nice conclusion, yes. So thank you all for coming online as well. And I just wanted to remind you that our next speaker is April 11th, 6 to 8 p.m. Diana Langa, Crossing Rivers by Yak Hide Boat and Horsehead Ferry, the significance of waterways in pre-1959 Tibet. And thank you again.
It's a great series. Thank you for coming on this day when some people have gone away. The building wasn't open. Sure do appreciate it. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.